More took place in this period than in any other time in the 19th century. There's a bibliographer, a man named Day, who collected all examples of these multiple murders, and this is the period where you have the most of them. In the period, we didn't have out-of-wedlock births, which we have today. About 40% of our births now occur out of wedlock. I don't know if you knew that. But they had a different kind of problem, early pregnancies. That is to say, 30 to 40% of children were born 7 or 8 months after the marriage. Now, we don't know, historians don't know why this should be so. We think the only explanation we have is that this is a way in which the youngsters could dictate their marriage partner. You get married, because there's no single mothers as we have today. If the boy gets the girl pregnant, then they get married. And so this is a way you could force the older people to endorse or at least accept your marriage if you felt they were not happy with the choice of your partner. But at any rate, about 30% of births occurring 7 to 8 months after marriage. Drinking of hard liquor reached an all-time high in this period, in per capita consumption. 5 gallons per person per year, which is the highest in American history. And highest in the Western world at the time, with the possible exception of Scotland. And we are drinking, we're talking about whiskey, not rum. Whiskey replaces rum as the major drink. So this isn't beer and cider, this is whiskey. And people drank all day long. They fed babies a little bit of liquor, whiskey to calm them down. People passed the bottle around in a court trial, from the prosecuting attorney to the judge, from the judge to the jury. And it was just, you took dram breaks instead of coffee breaks. And it was, if you exclude the slaves, which constituted about a fifth of the population, who didn't have much access to alcohol, then these figures are even higher. And it's not surprising, of course, that you get the beginnings of the temperance movement in this period, because people came to believe that alcohol was causing all the problems they saw. And it takes off. Now, it takes a century before Prohibition gets nationalized, but Prohibition had occurred in many of the states earlier. But you can see the sources of it here in this period. George Washington was appalled. He said, we're becoming a nation of drunkards. Nonetheless, he had a distillery on Mount Vernon and made a lot of money from it. But listen, Peacham, Vermont, little town, 1,500 people, had 30 distilleries. I mean, this is a major way of transforming grain into, which is very portable, into whiskey. Rioting among college students. We usually think of the 60s as being, this makes the 60s look tame. Between 1798 and 1808, American colleges were racked by a mounting incidents of defiant student rebellion on a scale never before seen or seen since. Colleges were closed for weeks on end. President Maxey of Brown here signed a treaty of amity with the students. He had to sign a treaty. Some buildings, like Nassau Hall at Princeton, gutted by fire. And sometimes nearly 40% of the student body was expelled. Now, the student body was small by those standards, 100 students, 120 students, but to expel 40% of them was a huge. It only stopped when the college presidents got together and said, we're not going to admit anybody who's been expelled by somebody else. And the students finally calmed down. But that period of about a decade. And no one knew quite why. They blamed everything. French ideas, they're reading too much Voltaire, they're reading Paul Paine, or they're drinking too much. There were all kinds of, no, any more than we know why the students exploded because these are the kids, the wealthy kids of what we would call, I suppose, upper middle class people, and the same thing was true in the 60s. We don't know why they exploded the way they did, any more than these people did back then. Now, religion, too, was democratized and transformed. Not only were most of the traditional European-based religious establishments destroyed, finally eliminated as establishments, but the modern world of many competing Christian denominations was created in this period. By 1850, America had become the most evangelically Christian nation in the world, and which I think it remains so. On the eve of the Revolution, the dominant religions, of course, were the Anglicans, the Church of England, and the Calvinist congregations in New England, in this area. By 1790, these established churches, so to speak, had already been supplanted in numbers by the Baptists and Methodists. The Baptists expanded from about 94 congregations in 1760 to 858 by 1790. Grew that much. And to become the single largest religious denomination in America, these are the Baptists. The Methodists there are no Methodists in America in 1760, and by 1790 they had become the second largest, and by 1810 or so, they are by far the largest denomination in America. The Methodists swept everything. Of course, they had no learned clergy, self-created clergymen. They didn't have to have a DD, they didn't go to college, and they were itinerant. They just traveled around and preached in barns, and of course they had an anti-Calvinist message. Everybody essentially could be saved if you just let go. And so they were very, very good at recruiting members. Evangelical religion spread everywhere, and the most famous gathering of religious seekers took place in the summer of 1801 at Cane Ridge, Kentucky. There are huge numbers of people, together with dozens of ministers of several different denominations, came together in what some people thought was the greatest outpouring of the Holy Spirit since the beginning of Christianity. Crowds estimated at 15 to 20,000 participated in a week of frenzied conversions. The heat, the noise, the confusion were overwhelming. Ministers, sometimes a half dozen, preaching at the same time in different parts of the camp. Shouted sermons from stumps and tree stumps and wagons. And hundreds, if not thousands of people fell to the ground, moaning and wailing in remorse. And they sang, laughed, barked, rolled, and jerked in excitement. Now, America had known revivals before, but nothing like this explosion of emotion. Of course, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit was accompanied by the pouring out of lots of intoxicating spirits. And critics of the excesses of Cane Ridge claimed that the frenzied excitement resulted in more souls being conceived than converted. But this excitement at Cane Ridge immediately became a symbol, and a kind of a symbol of the promises and the extravagances of the new kind of evangelical Protestantism spreading, especially in the West. And it touched off an outburst of religious chaos, religious inventiveness, I think unmatched in our history. And you just have religions being created by the dozens. Of course, most of them die away. There are a few survivors. Like Mormonism eventually comes out of this, but most of them fall away and die with a lot of them bred here in this state. Jemima Wilkinson and her followers, she thought she was a female Jesus Christ, and she got quite a few followers. And then she moved into New York, and then when she died, the whole thing fell apart. But there were those kinds of sects emerging everywhere in the country. Now, at the same time, Americans thought, as I said, that the torch of Western civilization was being passed to them, and that they were going to get shine even brighter. But instead, their art and literature became popularized and vulgarized, much to the chagrin of the elites. I'll give you one example of this. John Marshall, the Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, while he was Chief Justice, wrote a huge 5-volume biography of George Washington. The problem was nobody wanted to read those 5 volumes. Instead, they bought Parson Weems's short little biography, which seemed to many people to be a vulgar perversion of the ennobling art of history writing. Weems is the person who creates all the myths, the cherry tree myth, all these stories that you know about Washington's youth. In fact, he focuses the book on his youth. In all those 5 volumes that Marshall wrote, he devotes 1 page to Washington's youth. And here's Weems spending a whole book on it. And of course, that's what people wanted to read. And Weems's book has been, I think, the most popular biography of Washington. I think it's still in print, ever written. By 1815, the world of the founders was passing and a new generation was taking over. And many, in fact, all of the founders who lived into the 19th century, Franklin was lucky, he died in 1790 before this appalling future could emerge, were disillusioned with what they had got. They were disillusioned because they had begun with so many illusions. They hated parties. And nevertheless, parties emerged. They thought they could deal with the native peoples, that is the Indians, in a humane and respectful manner. Some of the letters that Knox, as Secretary of War, writes to Washington about how we can treat these native peoples in the West, even a modern anthropologist would agree with, saying he wants to preserve the culture. He's concerned that they might lose their culture. He sounds like a modern anthropologist. Nonetheless, he couldn't control what was happening in the West. These hordes of whites just overwhelming the peoples, surges of people who crossed the Appalachians in increasing numbers. They also thought, these founders, that slavery would naturally disappear, especially with the ending of the international slave trade in 1808. They thought that that was feeding slavery. Little did they know that slaves were reproducing themselves, particularly in the Upper South, at the same rate as the whites, doubling every 20 years. And of course, by 1820, Virginia is not a great cotton-producing state. Its major export was slaves, selling to Mississippi and Alabama. So they lived with this illusion that slavery is going to disappear. It was the greatest of their illusions. And of course, they could not have been real wrong about the future of slavery. But there was misleading evidence in the 1780s and 90s. Virginia was taking the lead. There are more anti-slave societies in Virginia than in the North. There are freedom suits everywhere. You could bring a suit, and the slave societies would bring suits. If you could show you had any white or Indian ancestor in your past, the whole line, bloodline is freed. And people, the whole lines, 30 people would be freed at once. And there were many, many of these suits at the outset. And you also had manumissions, just many manumissions by individual slaveholders who were felt guilty about what they were doing. And this is in Virginia, which, as I say, is the big state. And if Virginia is doing it, well, then everyone's going to do it. I mean, this is Virginia. As Virginia grows, so does the nation. They had other illusions, too, about the future. As late as 1821, Thomas Jefferson thought that there was not a young man now alive, I'm quoting here, that would not die a Unitarian. A Unitarian! He's a bright fellow, and he couldn't have been more wrong about the future. And of course, this is at a time when the Methodists, the evangelical Methodists and Baptists are growing by leaps and bounds. But before we become arrogant and condescending towards these people in the past, we should realize that we too live with illusions. Only we just don't know what they are. It'll take some historians later on to tell us, to tell their contemporaries in what ways were they wrong? How could they have ever thought that? It strikes me, in fact, that every generation lives with illusions. Different ones for each generation, and that's how history proceeds. Kind of record of exploded illusions. Get exploded, replaced by a new set. And that's what, in a sense, what the historical process is really all about. So the one lesson I would hope that might come out of this period is that of humility. Ultimately, I think that's what history really teaches, and ought to teach, is humility. Thank you.